Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on trouble at the top, vacancies at the Department of Homeland Security, undermining the mission. Today, the Committee on Homeland Security is meeting to examine how the unprecedented number of vacancies and continual turnover at the Department of Homeland Security is undermining its critical mission to secure the homeland. Put simply, since taking office, President Trump has decimated the leadership ranks of his own Department of Homeland Security. In recent weeks alone, President Trump has dismissed Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, circumvented the law by forcing Acting Deputy Secretary and Undersecretary for Management Claire Grady to resign so he could install Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAleenan as acting secretary. Also, Transportation Security Administrator David Bukowski to serve as deputy secretary while also running TSA, and pool nomination of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Director, prompting his resignation. In addition to the secretary and deputy secretary vacancies, at least 12 other critical positions across the department's key components and offices are operating without permanent leadership. The president has failed to nominate anyone to fill most of these vacancies, even though many have been held by acting officials for the entirety of the Trump administration. Moreover, there are another 50 senior leadership positions vacant throughout the department, including those tasked with overseeing the daily operation of DHS. This chaos appears to be by design, orchestrated by a president who wants to be able to remove the department's leadership on a whim. He has said himself, "I like acting because I move so quickly, it gives me more flexibility." In other words, the president wants more people who have not gone through the confirmation process because they are more beholden to him and more likely to carry out his controversial policies without question. Unfortunately, it is the department, its mission, and perhaps ultimately the American people that suffer. Since being created by the merger of 22 different agencies in 2003, DHS has struggled to mature and become a single cohesive department. These vacancies only exacerbate the department's fundamental challenges with acquisition management, budgeting, strategic planning, and personnel management. The department is left without consistent leadership in place to set a vision or agenda for the agency that it extends well beyond just border security. DHS's mission is broad and diverse and covers everything from counterterrorism to cybersecurity, to protection of dignitaries, to coordinating the federal government's response to natural disasters. The department needs a secretary with a breadth of knowledge to provide leadership across DHS and help further unify its component and offices to protect the homeland. The reliance on acting leadership further depresses morale at the department, which already consistently ranks at the bottom of federal employee surveys. Today, we are fortunate to have two expert witnesses before us who can speak to the challenges DHS is facing under this administration. The Government Accountability Office has audited the department's management since DHS was established, giving the Comptroller General unique perspective on the current situation. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General is charged with providing independent oversight and promoting excellence, integrity, and accountability within DHS. Despite having left the position in late 2017, Mr. Roth is the last confirmed DHS Inspector General, as his permanent replacement has still not been confirmed. I know his testimony will inform our oversight of the leadership boards at DHS. I thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to this important discussion. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my statement, I wanted to take a moment to recognize the lives lost in the recent terrorist attack on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka and on Passover in San Diego. Places of worship should be sanctuaries where people, regardless of faith, can worship without fear. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee on ways to stop these kind of despicable acts. Mr. Chairman, I'm truly glad that you called this hearing today. Management vacancies, mismanagement, and poor employee morale have plagued the Department of Homeland Security since it was created. Today, 17 DHS leaderships lack positions of a permanent leader. Just like in 2013 during the Obama administration when 18 leadership positions lacked permanent leaders. Then Chairman McCall convened a similar hearing to examine the issue. At that hearing, then Ranking Member Thompson accurately blamed the obstructive Senate minority for holding up key appointments, questioned how the morale of 240,000 employees could be adversely affected by the leadership positions being filled by acting personnel, and strenuously argued the best way to fix the morale problem at DHS was for Congress to act to reform organizational structure of the department. Nearly 6 years since that hearing, Chairman Thompson's statement still holds true. I agree wholeheartedly with what he had to say and ask unanimous consent to include a copy of his statement into the record.
Without objection.
As the chairman said 6 years ago, to truly address the ongoing problems with poor employee retention and morale, Congress must fix the department's organization and structure. I hope we can come together to enact a meaningful authorization bill that unifies the department and provides its employees with funding, authorities, training, and equipment they need. In the interim, I would implore members of Congress to stop vilifying DHS employees for doing their jobs and calling for the elimination of their agencies. I'm very concerned about the impact of these statements on employee morale. Every day, DHS employees do an exceptional job carrying out their critical missions. No one should blame the men and women of DHS for problems Congress has allowed to fester. I look forward to working with the chairman on this DHS authorization bill, and I thank him again for convening this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Gene Dorado, the U.S. Comptroller General since 2010. Mr. Dorado has served in many roles during his more than 45 years at the Government Accountability Office. In his current role as Comptroller General, he oversees the development and issuance of hundreds of reports and testimonies to Congress each year that examine how to make the government work more efficiently and effectively. Next, Mr. Roth, John Roth, who was Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security from 2014 through 2017. As an independent Inspector General, Mr. Roth led the independent oversight work of his office to promote excellence, integrity, and accountability within DHS. Mr. Roth retired from the federal government after 32 years of service. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Dorado.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about the management challenges at the Department of Homeland Security. I think critical leadership is needed to be sustained to address a range of fundamental management challenges at the department. There are 3 areas that are on GAO's high-risk list, which we keep as the highest risk across the federal government. The first is strengthening the management functions of the department, which includes acquisition, IT management, financial management, human capital management. Second is reforming the flood insurance program. Third is limiting the federal government's fiscal exposure by better managing climate change risks. These areas are all very important. And our latest update that I presented to the Congress last month on the high-risk area, as of March 2019, we found in the strengthening management function area at the department that the department had fully met 17 of the 30 critical outcomes that we're looking for and agreed to with the department in these management functions. But there was still work to do in many other areas. For example, in the acquisition area, we believe that they have to use the tools that they put in place to more effectively manage their acquisition process to get better outcomes and have a more efficient and effective process. Secondly, they're a long way from having modern management, financial management systems in place. They're in the process of instituting new system at the Coast Guard, but they need systems at FEMA and ICE as well. So that area is in need of reform. They continue to have financial reporting and information security weaknesses as part of their annual financial audits, even though they get a clean opinion. Third is in the area of human capital management. There are critical vacancies and skill gaps across the department in the acquisition area, the cybersecurity workforce area, the financial management area. So that area needs attention as well. We've been working with the department in a very constructive fashion. We meet on a quarterly basis with them to review their progress in addressing these issues. In the cybersecurity realm, we've made a number of recommendations to improve their activities in overseeing the efforts across the federal government to identify cybersecurity concerns. You know, I identified cybersecurity as a government-wide issue in 1997. We had identified critical infrastructure protection in 2003. Still to this date, I don't believe the federal government's moving with the sense of urgency commensurate with the evolving threat in the cybersecurity area. So we've made some recommendations to DHS to strengthen its efforts, but also to have it work more effectively with the critical sectors we have across the economy, the communications sector, the electricity sector, financial markets, and other sectors to make sure that their efforts to voluntarily use the standards from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies to protect their computer assets are effective in this area as well. Now, while we're focused on these high-risk areas, we also look at functions at the department across its spectrum of responsibilities. In April, on the 19th, I sent the acting secretary a letter outlining 26 high-priority GAO recommendations that had not yet been implemented that span emergency preparedness areas, border security, transportation security, cyber security, chemical security programs in other areas, and so we'll be working with them on this. I would say we've had a very constructive working relationship with DHS leadership and been very engaged with them. We plan to continue to engage with the current leadership in whatever capacity they're functioning in, whether active or acting or confirmed, and hopefully over time more confirmed positions will be approved by the Senate to provide some greater stability in their management functions. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Raw to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify here today concerning leadership vacancies at the Department of Homeland Security. As you know, I served as Inspector General for DHS for almost 4 years until I retired in November of 2017 after almost 32 years of government service. In the best of times, DHS is an unruly and difficult to manage organization, and we are not in the best of times. The nature and extent of senior leadership vacancies in the department is a cause for concern, as such pervasive vacancies significantly hamper the department's ability to carry out its all-important mission. I had the unique opportunity and privilege to examine all areas of DHS programs and operations. Our reviews found, even when fully staffed, a department that was challenged in meeting its goals and struggling to mature as an organization. Our reviews highlighted significant issues that touched nearly every area of the department, including acquisition management, personnel management, employee morale, grants management, cybersecurity, border security, and transportation security. We sought to understand the root causes for these persistent shortfalls. These shortfalls persisted over time, regardless of administration, and can be fairly attributed to the following 2 root causes. First, a lack of unity of effort, and second, poor internal controls. DHS has demonstrated an inability to mesh divergent components with different histories, cultures, and missions into a single agency with a unity of effort. Knitting together a unified DHS with all components requires strong and committed leadership and oversight. This goal is thwarted by pervasive senior leadership vacancies. The failures reflected in audit reports also reflect an inability to develop, oversee, and enforce the internal controls that are typical of a mature organization. The current environment of relatively weak internal controls affects all aspects of the department's mission. Even when fully staffed, the Secretary's office and the Deputy Secretary's office are simply too small to be aware of, much less effectively manage the significant and varied issues that face DHS. In my time as Inspector General, through 2 administrations, senior leadership was continually caught by surprise by various issues that bubbled to the surface. They simply did not have the staff or the structure to be fully informed to conduct effective oversight. In November 2016, after noting some progress in attempting to ensure a unity of effort, we noted that that progress was largely as a result of the force of will of a small team of department's leadership. However, we concluded that such effort was unsustainable in the long run, absent structural changes to ensure streamlined oversight, communication, responsibility, and accountability, changes that must be enshrined in law. In November 2017, in one of my final reports regarding the management challenges facing the department, I wrote that senior leadership positions suffer from the lack of permanent, presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed officials. As a result, there has not been the opportunity or leadership stability to implement needed reforms. Long-standing vacancies hurt the department in a number of ways. First, those who hold the position in an acting capacity or simply in a caretaker role and are justifiably hesitant to make decisions that would tie the hands of the individual who would ultimately be appointed to that position. Second, a full leadership cadre of presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed officials increases political accountability, particularly as it relates to congressional oversight. Third, presidential appointees are better able to represent the department's interests in interagency coordination. Finally, full-time political appointees can bring fresh perspectives and energies to a position. They are better able to reflect the administration's policies and often have a desire to drive specific issues to completion during their tenure. The practice of dual hatting, having senior officials serve 2 roles, undermines the seriousness of the mission of the agencies whose leadership is being plundered. This lack of settled leadership contributes to the significant morale problems that are endemic to DHS components. For DHS to mature as an organization and address the significant root causes of its shortfalls, it must have in place dedicated, long-term leadership. I thank the committee again for the invitation to testify. This concludes my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I thank both witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I'll now recognize myself for questions. And this is pretty much to both of the witnesses. In your experience, what effect does constant change in leadership have on morale throughout a department?
I think it depends mostly on the actions of the people who are in the positions at the time, whether they're acting or not. The optimum is to have a confirmed person in place over a sustained period of time. But, the way our system is structured, fundamentally, change is inevitable. With any change in administration, you have a whole new 3,000 people at the top of the federal government that are in place. Now, Congress has set expectations through the Vacancy Act that the appointments on an acting basis be on a temporary nature, so nobody believes that it should be on an ongoing basis. But there is constant change at the federal level across the federal departments and agencies on an ongoing basis. And even within administrations, the turnover of top political leadership occurs, and occurs on a fairly frequent basis. This can undermine the sustained effort that's needed in order to address long-term management issues. So it's a very important question that you're asking. It goes in part to individual decisions made by the President and by the Congress, but also goes to the nature of the system that we have in place that pretty much makes it difficult to sustain efforts across administrations. I would say that this effort at DHS, some of their efforts have at least been sustained from the prior administration into this new one. They need to make a lot of improvements, but I'm pleased that there's been some continuity between administrations.
Mr. Roth.
I think it very much depends on the specific component or agency that's involved. Certainly, if you have a systemic and pervasive morale problem, employees are going to look to the leaders for fixing the problem. If that leader is in a temporary position, he might be stymied or she may be stymied from being able to engage in whatever long-term fix, whether it needs to be pay parity or needs to be training or some other issue that requires a long-term systemic fix. It's going to be much more difficult for an acting person to do it rather than a permanent appointed person.
Thank you. In April of this year, I introduced and Congress passed what's called the Morale Act. It was primarily focused on the fact that in the scheme of ranking, DHS was 17 out of 17. In other words, they were at the bottom. And to the extent that having so many acting people in a department, with a department that's struggling in terms of employee morale, how do you fix it with acting people in dual roles and already having primary responsibility for another agency? Employees talk to us, they really want to carry out the mission, but with the musical chairs at the leadership, it's been a struggle. So I'll give you a chance to address that.
Well, first, I would say we're fortunate that we have very dedicated professional people at the Department of Homeland Security who will carry out their job regardless of the circumstances. It is much more difficult to get buy-in when you have people in acting positions with long-term plans and efforts that are underway, because people are historically skeptical in the federal government of whether the latest effort to make improvements is going to be sustained over a period of time. And so the bureaucracies don't respond well to a lot of change quickly over time. It's more difficult with an acting person. But I would note that DHS has had morale problems where there have been confirmed people in the positions or acting positions. I think there's some structural issues there that need to be dealt with. I think the legislation, Mr. Chairman, you sponsored is a good effort to try to get at some of those problems. And the problems don't exist across the components in DHS. There are a couple components that have more systemic morale issues than other components. But it's a difficult issue to address, and I think the Morale Act would help. It actually codifies a number of our recommendations that have been made.
Mr. Roth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the Morale Act, for example, has a number of long-term fixes for the morale problem. We didn't get to this place overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. But again, because it's long-term, it's going to be required long-term planning, long-term budgeting, kinds of things that are impossible to do with a series of actings.
Thank you. Yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've talked about in my opening statement, since its inception, DHS has struggled with the disparate missions and priorities, and as you made reference in your statement, Mr. Roth, they have a real problem with unity of effort among the DHS components. And Mr. Dodaro, you made reference to this, just the fundamental structural problems. What, in your opinion, clearly y'all are two of the leading experts on this, what do we need to do about this? This has been a problem since we stood the department up, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. Just fundamentally, what does this committee need to do to help give some stability to the management of the department?
I think, as a sign of the challenge, the day the DHS started operations, we designated implementation and transformation of the department as a high-risk area across the government. Now, we've seen some changes over time. in some of these agencies. So there's been some improvements in having strategic planning and having better efforts in place. But there's still a long way from having a unified, well-functioning organization. You know, part of the problem was, and still remains, is that there are weaknesses in some of the 22 components that were merged into the department. So the department did not receive, 22 well-functioning units at that time, and it continues to be a struggle. So I think the suggestions that John made in his opening statement, Mr. Roth, are very important in terms of having a better structure at the top of the department, was better financed and better functions in place. I think also, and I've said this for other agencies, including the Department of Defense, there needs to be a chief management officer position that transcends administrations. These efforts to focus on fundamental management weaknesses are not going to get solved in a short period of time. In fact, right now, they're targeting these financial management system improvements to not be in effect until 2020 and way beyond that effort over time. Same thing with morale. It needs sustained attention. So you need a management infrastructure. Each president should have their ability to put the political leadership in, but you need to have a well-resourced continuity management functions to integrate them across the department so that it can be responsive to policy changes. So I think that's the fundamental change, and it needs to transcend administrations.
Does that model exist in any other department?
The changes that were made to the IRS, for example, the IRS commissioner has a 5-year appointment. The FAA has a 5-year appointment. Social Security Administration has a 5-year appointment. So there are models. We've suggested that that be put in place at Defense for a chief management official. Congress has agreed to have a chief management official, but they didn't go as far as I think they need to go and have that person span administrations. So there is some recognition in certain positions you need more continuity, so you should have a tenured person in there for basic management functions. They're not a policy official, but they're to make sure that the department operates effectively regardless of what policies are implemented. Right now, you don't have that.
You made reference to the fact that the department struggles to mature, and I wholeheartedly agree. Aside from that management deficiency, what could we do to help it mature? Because I have been frustrated by that. It doesn't seem to be growing and maturing.
Yeah, John?
I mean, what we have now in DHS, I think, is basically a holding company for 17 sort of independent components. Mm-hmm. And my experience in both administrations was that I would go and I'd brief the secretary and the deputy secretary on various findings that we had, and they were completely caught by surprise. They didn't have the ability and the staff and the structure to get the kind of reporting that they needed to be able to look at problems and fix them. And I think that's a personnel issue, a staffing issue, and a structural issue that can be fixed by this Congress. In other words, beef up the ability of the secretary and the deputy, as well as the undersecretary for management and the undersecretary for policy plans and strategy, to be able to have true insight into the workings of the various parts of the department.
Did either of you or your offices draft a proposal that would do that and to present to the Congress? Do you know if there's something in writing about how that would look that we could review?
We don't have anything currently in writing, but I'd be happy to put some ideas together for consideration. In addition to what John is saying, which I agree with completely, the other thing Congress can do is to have more oversight. And I know in the beginning, in the creation of DHS, the big complaint was there was too much congressional oversight from too many different committees. But I think that helped spur them to make changes. They didn't like it, and a lot of people didn't think it was efficient, but I think it was very helpful. Right now, for example, the quadrennial Homeland Security review is late. It's not submitted. Congress hasn't, is trying to get more attention to that. I mean, the unity of effort, and more. I mean, congressional oversight can be an important catalyst. In any area we end up taking off the high-risk list, it's in part because the Congress acted, both legislatively and providing funding, necessary to do that. So I wouldn't, you know, there's some structural problems with the department, but without a commensurate active Congress and providing oversight, it's still, you know, it won't work. You need both components.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this extremely important hearing. Let me first of all say that I agree with the ranking member that if any of us are calling for the dismantling of any department, it is not serving the federal employees well and probably does not contribute to the kind of morale we all would like to have. And I'm saying that because I think it is what I've said, it's what I believe, and I believe that no matter who is in the White House, I think one of the problems the public now has with Congress is that it's almost dramatic the way we can change our positions based on who is in the White House. So I think ICE needs to be probably, like many other departments, dealt with and improved. But I don't think we shut down ICE or anything else in Homeland. I think we need to concentrate on fixing it. And the day we stopped defending things because it's somebody in the White House that we happen to be connected with is the day that I think we began to move this country forward. I will disagree with anybody. I think I'm just that tough, whether it's me disagreeing with President Obama, which I did publicly when he was in office, or President Trump. And I hope that my children will never see a day when I defend wrong based on who is in the White House. Now, let me go on. I apologize for my sermonette, but nature abhors a vacuum. Do both of you agree? I mean, Aristotle said it years ago, but I think it's centuries ago, but I think it still is a fact, and I think we're seeing it now with Homeland Security. The theory, as the theory goes, there's something that will fill every vacuum, and I think right now it's indecision, and I'm particularly concerned because I serve, I wish everybody in the country had my district, which is the largest city in the state, and then 14 of the smallest cities. And we're having flooding. And we have positions that are vacant that need to be in Homeland Security that need to be addressing these issues. I mean, we have farmers suffering because of the tariffs. Soybeans dropped to $8 right now. My farmers are all complaining. And then right as they are getting hit with the tariffs, they get hit with the Missouri River. And we don't, and the governors in Nebraska, Missouri, all declared, emergency, state of emergencies. So what can we do? I mean, the slowness. I can't even get an answer on the fact that you have to have $8 million in damage before you have this threshold before you can get assistance for people in these small towns. You can destroy a whole town like Orick, Missouri, and not reach the threshold. I said a lot. Help me, please, both of you, either or both.
There's a couple of things with FEMA I think are important and on point to what your program is. First of all, the flood insurance program is not actuarially sound, and right now there are over $20 billion in debt to Treasury after Congress has already recently forgiven $16 billion in debt. So that program, it needs to be better managed. There needs to be better mapping. There needs to be better issues.
Both.
Yeah,
we need to forgive. We should have forgiven the whole entire debt. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, but yeah, I think the idea was when the program was set up is the people who benefited from flood insurance were supposed to pay for the program. Right now, that cost has been transferred to the general taxpayers, and everybody's
Right.
paying for it. So we either ought to say that's the policy and we ought to do it, or we should make some other fundamental reform changes to that program, because it's not going to be ever on a sound fiscal basis to pay for itself over time, particularly with some of the weather forecast information. Secondly, more effort needs to be put in to build resilience into the communities in the first place. This is where a long-term strategy comes in place. I commend the Congress for passing the Disaster Recovery Reform Act last year, which allows some of that money to be used for resilience building and also to bring in additional structural changes to flood mitigation approaches and elevation standards. I was disappointed the administration's revoked the executive order on a risk on a flood mitigation strategy. So there's a lot of things that could be done. I mean, there's some things that need to be done in the short term, as you're talking about, but if we don't prepare for the long term in this area, the federal government is very exposed at a time where it's on a long-term unsustainable fiscal path. This is going to be a problem. So you need effective leadership, but we need long-term efforts and planning efforts, particularly in the Homeland Security Department, and particularly in the area of both flooding and also building resilience in the future.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York, Mr. King is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for the testimony. Mr. Darrow, it's good to see you back again. I agree with Mr. Cleaver in many respects. We've had variations of this hearing over the last 10, 12, 13 years under all secretaries and all administrations. And I believe even under Secretary Johnson, we had maybe more vacancies than we do now. And I think he's one of the best secretaries we ever had. He had a good bipartisan relationship. So it's something endemic to the department. Now, one concern I do have, and I think it's on target for today, is that, you know, coming from New York, and I'm sure Congressman Rose agrees with this department was created because of 9/11, because of terrorist attacks, counterterrorism. I know that issues from immigration to global warming are all important, but in going through both of your statements, I don't see a word about terrorism. Now, does that mean that you feel it's all under control? I mean, we have the fusion centers, we've had problems administering the grants in the past. I know certainly in New York that's been an issue as far as the cooperation with local and state law enforcement. And my concern is, are we losing the purpose for which this department was created? I mean, all these other issues are important. I realize that by incorporating different departments in, you also assume those responsibilities. But the ultimate responsibility was to fight terrorism. I never want to go through another 9/11 and say, oh, well, we missed that attack as we were talking about global warming that day. I mean, to me, I want to make sure that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, white supremacists, whoever we're talking about, is not able to launch a terrorist attack. And do you believe the department right now is doing enough, whether it's acting or permanent or whatever, are they doing enough to combat terrorism and to prevent another 9/11? Ask the both of you.
I mean, certainly, for example, transportation security, both I think the GAO and the Inspector General's office has done a lot of work in examining sort of what the shortfalls are with transportation security, which continues to be sort of the bright, shiny trophy of any sort of domestic international terrorist attack. So I think the focus has been there, but then when you look at transportation security, what are you looking at? You're looking at the ability of TSA, for example, to make the kinds of acquisitions that will actually pay dividends in keeping us safe. Looking at how it is that we hire and screen transportation security officers. So it all comes back to fundamentals about how it is that we budget, how it is that we plan, how it is that we hire, and how it is that we train our folks. So while it is a multi-mission agency, certainly terrorism is always at the forefront. I can tell you that just from my experience working within the department. But again, the ability to combat terrorism is only as effective as the ability of DHS to function as an organization.
John mentioned, we focus a lot on their terrorism-related responsibilities. We have a lot of recommendations in the Transportation Security Administration. We look at border security. I got recommendations there as well. Protecting the chemical plants that we have in the country and the CFATS program, we've had a lot of recommendations in that area. The transportation worker identification cards never been evaluated for effectiveness. We've got recommendations in that area as well. But I also, believe we've been spending a lot of time also focusing in on what potential attacks could come in the future, as opposed to we've reacted to the way people have exploited us in the past, but we also need to prepare for the future. And I think cybersecurity is a critical component of that. So we spent a lot of time and effort on not only DHS's role, but the government-wide strategy. Now, there are 4 areas I think we don't have a comprehensive national and global strategy to deal with supply chain issues, cyber workforce issues, and other issues. Departments and agencies still have weaknesses across the board.
Time is running. I hate to interrupt you. My time is running out. How about the grant system to the local police and fire departments?
Yeah, we've had recommendations in the grants area as well to determine the effectiveness, the coordination approach, to make sure that they're not duplicating efforts in the grant areas as well. We've made recommendations in those areas. There are things that can be improved in those areas.
I guess it bothered me. We're 45 minutes into the meeting, into the hearing, before we mentioned terrorism. Right. And when this started, that's all we were talking about was terrorism. I just don't want to, I realize there's other issues, but I just don't want to get sidetracked on that. Right. Also, I have to respectfully disagree with one thing you said about having the multitude of committees watching Homeland Security, and you also mentioned the Chemical Plant Act. That, in fact, the chairman was on the committee, and I believe Mr. Rogers was also. It took us almost a year and a half to get chemical plant security legislation through because of all the departments had to go through. And various special interests and other committees are holding it up for this reason, that reason. In the meantime, we could have had a catastrophe here in the country. I think right now the chemical plant security is done pretty well. But again, what we had to go through to get that done, and maybe I'm being selfish here, I don't think the other committees added much to it other than to obstruct it. And during all that time, we were afraid there could have been a chemical plant attack here in this country. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to imply there couldn't be some streamlining of efforts, but I don't think, the answer isn't no congressional oversight.
And again, I thank you for your work over the years. It's been a privilege working with you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the young lady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses, Comptroller General Dodaro and Mr. Roth, for joining us. I have to slightly disagree with the false equivalency of the DHS vacancies expressed by a few of my colleagues here this morning. Donald Trump, I believe, has created a leadership void at the Department of Homeland Security, and he has done so intentionally. During a February interview, he said, "I like actings because I can move so quickly. It gives me more flexibility." These are his own words. When Superstorm Sandy devastated my district, we turned to FEMA. But right now, the top post at FEMA is vacant. Our nation faces unprecedented cyber threats as well as all too real possibilities of terrorism. But the top posts at DHS's Management, Science and Technology and Strategy directorates are also empty. And the top official at TSA, our first line of defense against another 9/11, simultaneously serves as the entire agency's acting deputy secretary. Neither of those positions should be a part-time job. Meanwhile, as Donald Trump pursues and implements policies which many believe undermine the rule of law, such as family separation, we do not have a confirmed DHS Inspector General to investigate those abuses. So I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Rothman, but I did want to put that on the record because there is a false equivalency, and I don't want that to be put out there into the public. The president has said it himself. Mr. Roth, around the time of your retirement at DHS as DHS Inspector General, you wrote a letter to Congress regarding your department's failure to timely release the full version of a report on possible misconduct during the implementation of the president's Muslim ban. In fact, you said, "This is the first time in my tenure as Inspector General that the department has indicated that they may assert this privilege in connection with one of our reports or consider preventing the release of a report on that basis." In fact, we regularly have published dozens of reports that delve into the department's rationale for specific policies and decisions and comment on the basis and process on which these decisions were made. Could you elaborate on how the department sought to interfere in the release of the Muslim ban report? And do you believe political appointees at the department or at the White House itself sought to improperly withhold the work of the Inspector General's office from Congress?
Thank you for your question. The report that you refer to, obviously, is the report with regard to the so-called Muslim ban or the travel ban that we investigated and did an assessment of, which was the kind of work that we would do over time. Typically, the only privilege that the department has ever invoked is the attorney-client privilege, which we have universally respected in the course of our work because of the nature of the attorney-client privilege and the importance that it has of ensuring that senior leadership gets unvarnished legal advice. But for this report, a new privilege was interjected, which is the deliberative process privilege, which is a common law privilege that is typically done in civil litigation. This is the first time that we had ever seen this. I polled some of my other inspectors general in other agencies, and they had never seen the ability or the use of this deliberative process in our reports, because most of our reports are in fact deliberative process. What we examine is the ability or how it is that the department makes decisions, gets to a specific policy, and implements that. So
in your humble estimation, do you believe that that was an attempt to block the ability for that report to be examined by Congress?
Certainly the report with the redactions is considerably less than the report without the redactions. I think there was very important information that was redacted from that report, again, in an unprecedented manner. So I was not still at the post when the final redactions were made, but certainly reading it, there's a lot that's missing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this most important hearing. I agree with the general premise that acting is not as good as having someone in place. I think we can all agree on that. But I want to just touch real quickly on something Mr. Dodaro said, because being lost in all this are all the great people that dedicate their lives to trying to keep our country safe. And I think, and you mentioned to find dedicated people in Homeland Security, couldn't possibly agree more. The best example of that was during the government shutdown. You had the TSOs at airports throughout this country working for free, and these people are not rich. They don't have a lot of money, and they still sucked it up and did the right thing and kept us safe. And that is perhaps the best example of the American spirit alive and well at Homeland Security. Nevertheless, the problems at Homeland Security have been pervasive, and it crosses administrations. I think at one point in the Obama administration, there was 18 leadership offices with unconfirmed or unappointed leaders. There's 17 today. During the Obama administration, at one point, there were 10 Senate confirmable positions that were led by unconfirmed individuals. Today, there are 8. And at the height of the Obama administration, the employee satisfaction score was 56%. It's 60 now. Pretty much even. It's pretty much how it's been throughout the administrations. But the notion that acting is going to be better, I don't think it is. I will note this, Ms. Watson-Coleman and myself, we're chair and ranking member for TSA for several years, and we did an awful lot of oversight. There is no substitute for us doing our job and having hearings and bringing people before us and holding them accountable. When you do that, you hear things. And here's some of the things that Ms. Watson-Coleman and I came up with, one of which was a 5-year appointment for the TSA administrator, critically important. And I think those, to your point, going across just 5-year terms, giving some sense of permanency to some people in key positions at these agencies is very important. And both sides are going to slow down appointments in the Senate. That's a political beast, and we don't have any control over that, but it's something that neither side should do for the good of the country, in my mind. But I want to get back to one thing, Mr. Roth. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about this a second. Homeland Security perhaps has the most disjointed oversight of any agency in Congress. We are spread across, I think, 6 different, Mr. Rogers, at least 6 different committees. Standing committee, over 100 when you include subcommittees, but over 6 standing committees. That's insane to me, and I think it hampers our effort to do what Ms. Watson-Coleman and I did with TSA. And I dare say we made that a better agency. So what's your thoughts on the multi-jurisdictions of the committees?
I agree. I had the opportunity earlier in my career to work on the 9/11 Commission as a staff member looking at terrorist financing, and I know from firsthand one of the discussions of the commission was to make more streamlined and more rational, and that was in fact one of the recommendations of the committee is to do in fact that. But here we are a number of years later, and that still has not been accomplished. But I agree, the diffracted nature of the oversight is, I think, distracting. But I will echo Mr. Dodaro's comments that oversight works. I've seen it firsthand. Letters get answered, things get done in preparations for hearings that would not otherwise happen. So even to the extent that it is fragmented, I compliment this committee on the sort of sustained focus. And you, for example, and Ms. Watson-Coleman, where I've testified a number of times on TSA issues, it truly works. Notwithstanding the fragmentation, we should continue on.
Yeah, Mr. Dodaro, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's always possible to make improvements and to make streamlining efforts there, but it's up to the Congress to decide on how to do that. It's obviously easier to respond to those things if you have a well-functioning organization in place to be able to be prepared. But the philosophy I've always had, it's up to the Congress to decide how it wants to organize. It's up to DHS to make their management better, and a lot of it's not dependent on how Congress is organized. Some of it is, as Mr. Roth has pointed out, but I think that oversight is essential in this area. I know when agencies have to prepare, as John's saying, for a hearing, there are things that get done. We get access to more information, too, in a timely manner, and both the GAO and the IG, if there's hearings that Congress is going to have. And it doesn't always have to be hearings. It could be exchange of letters and other things.
Well, I'm out of time, but I'd just like to ask if someone else would pick up on this, and that is going forward, I just want to know what else we can do to streamline these processes and make these agencies work better. But having a sense of permanency and leadership, to me, is absolutely critical. And I encourage both sides to encourage the Senate to get these, either thumbs up or thumbs down on these positions quicker so that we can fill these voids. But leading as an acting is not going to cut the mustard going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with what you're saying, and part of this issue occurs at other agencies as well. I mentioned the Department of Defense. I think one of the main reasons that we don't have this conversation as much with them is you have a military that stays in place regardless of who's in administration. It has its own structure, it has permanent leadership, it has good succession planning. But if you look on the civilian side of DOD, you have a lot of the same problems that you have with Homeland Security. And I can point to other agencies across the government as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Speaking of oversight, the chair and ranking member of the House and chair and ranking member of the Senate, we sent to the Secretary a letter asking when would the quadrennial Homeland Review Committee report would be submitted. It's over a year overdue, and we've yet, since our March 28th letter, it hadn't even been acknowledged. So that sometimes letters get responded to and sometimes they don't, but this is part of what we have to do from an oversight perspective to try to get things done, and we'll continue to do that. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since Mr. Katko asked for some follow-up, I'm actually going to do that. I want to read just some of the, I want to read all of the vacancies we have. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, vacant. Federal Emergency Management Agency, vacant. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, vacant. The U.S. Secret Service, vacant. The Office of Operations Coordination, vacant. Privacy Office, vacant. Management Directorate, vacant. Chief Financial Officer, vacant. Science and Technology, vacant. Office of Strategy, Policy and Plans, vacant. Office of Public Affairs, vacant. Office of Inspector General, vacant. The Secretary, vacant. And as was mentioned, the Deputy Secretary, who simultaneously holds the Transportation Security Administration position. I mean, this is a lot of vacancies. And what was, as was mentioned at the outset, only, I believe, 4 have been nominated. And the Senate is in control right now of the Republican Party. Unlike when Obama was president, and he actually nominated people, and the Senate went out of their way to block his nominations. We have a president now who is deliberately not filling vacancies. Either that, or people don't want to work for him. It's one of the two. And when you have a history of a president taking out people who don't agree with his policies, I don't blame people for not wanting to work there, but this is part of the mismanagement. And to try to equivalate the prior administration to this one is completely unacceptable. It's totally wrong to do, and just wanted to clarify that for the record. Mr. Daddario, this week the House is going to vote on H.R. 9. It's the Climate Action Now Act. I'm a firm believer that climate change is a national security crisis. Your report as Comptroller General, the GAO, as well as your testimony here today, highlights the risk posed by climate change to our homeland security. Now, FEMA has no permanent leader right now, and we know that hurricane season is around the corner. Weather events are getting more extreme, even in coastal California, where my district is. How dangerous is it for FEMA to operate without stable leadership?
Well, I think in the short run, I mean, there is an acting person in charge of there who was I believe, the deputy beforehand. We saw, though, in the 2017 hurricanes, how FEMA could be stretched by multiple disasters. So we've had a lot of recommendations about that, about how they could have better contracting in place. So I think FEMA needs to aggressively provide more effort on its contracting and staffing efforts and its ability to deal with not only one disaster, but multiple disasters over time. And we've made a lot of recommendations in that area. So I think, FEMA has spent a lot of effort trying to improve itself, but I think the current environment in which it's going to be operating with more frequent, more intensive storms predicted by the National Climate Assessment is going to stretch its capabilities. So I think, it's operating on a margin that I think can go either way depending upon how many disasters occur at any one particular point in time. I think if it's a single disaster, your odds are better. If it's multiple ones, your odds are lower.
Right. Mr. Roth, how long were you at the Department of Homeland Security?
About 46 months.
46 months?
Yes.
You mentioned briefly, and you touched on this, as Inspector General of DHS, you were tasked with the mission of providing independent oversight and promote excellence, integrity, and accountability within DHS. As part of that mission, you conducted the detailed investigation and produced reports for members of Congress. In 2017, you investigated the president's travel ban and produced an 87-page report summarizing your findings, which was submitted to DHS leadership. Is that the report you briefly mentioned a moment ago?
Yes, and to be clear, we were reviewing DHS programs and operations, not the White House's.
And was part of that to investigate the Muslim ban?
It was to determine how well DHS reacted and implemented the president's policies.
And that report was redacted, is that right?
That's correct.
Did your experience with that report lead to your decision to retire?
No, it did not.
Okay. All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of our panel witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start with the Comptroller General Daddario with a few questions, if I might. I believe it's, if I'm correct in this, in your testimony, You mentioned the 8 acting officials serving in Senate-confirmed positions. How does that compare to other periods of time in the department's history? Would you address that?
We haven't gone back and made that exact comparison over time, but there have been, acting positions that's been referred to today in prior administrations, and you have normal turnover that occurs with any administration. So I don't have the exact comparison.
Okay, without exact comparisons, maybe we could speak just a second in a general terminology. Is this far outside the bounds of anything that you've ever seen?
I would say it's in the upper areas of concern.
Okay.
And I've been a GAO for 46 years, so I've seen a lot of things.
I would imagine. I would imagine. Previous GAO studies in 2012 and 2013 have noted the historical issues of vacancies in DHS's senior executive service positions. In your opinion, what might be the root cause of that? And maybe if you would add to that, how would we address it?
In terms of the vacancies in the positions?
Yes, correct. What is your opinion of why there's been vacancies in that position, and how do we address it?
Yeah, well, I think, number one, it needs to be a department priority. They need to focus on this issue, and I think that there needs to be attention and inquiries at the White House and the presidential personnel process in terms of how they're going about identifying candidates for those positions. It has to be a priority. There has to be an effort to focus on it, and I think Congress has a role to inquire about how that process is going and when their intentions to fill these positions over a period of time. Right now, you have about 4 or 5 nominations pending before the Congress for the FEMA director, the chief financial officer, the inspector general officer. So obviously they're working to try to identify people to nominate them. That's occurred, but then these other vacancies are relatively recent, some of them. So, but I think it's Congress's obligation and duty to inquire.
Sure. Well, in this current administration, the position of Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis was vacant for 7 months, according to our record, with an acting Undersecretary awaiting confirmation for the last 5 months. In December of 2013, when this committee held a similar hearing on vacancies, the position of the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis was vacant for over a year. With the unique mandate this office has within the intelligence community, as the federal government lead for sharing information and intelligence with all really state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and the private sector, how do you think our intelligence capability is impacted by a vacancy, specifically at this position?
I think it's worrisome. I think in that area you need to have a stable leadership, and you are dealing with a number of entities across the federal government. Mr. Roth mentioned this before, but when you're in a position like a FEMA director where you're dealing with elected state and local officials, but in the intelligence area, you're dealing with the intelligence community, about 16 different operations and other things. I think it's better to have a confirmed position in that, or person in that job.
I did see the Honorable Roth, the former Inspector General, Department of Homeland Security, nodding in agreement there on a couple things there. So let me pivot to you, Mr. Roth, if I could. In your time as the IG, did you witness any impact on Homeland Security and national security of having senior leadership vacancies filled by acting positions?
In my tenure, I was one of the people in a wave of appointments. So actually, when I was appointed, pretty much everyone had there were no vacancies. We had a secretary, deputy secretary, head of ICE, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't personally witness that, obviously, until the change of administration, which of course is natural to have those vacancies then.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the young lady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. I want to put something in context. Context is important. As Mr. Mueller informed us yesterday, I want to put something here in context. We talked about the vacancies that have existed from time to time through other administrations, particularly the Obama administration as it relates to DHS, but we failed to realize that in this administration, Republicans were in charge of the presidency, the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House of Representatives and could have had as many people anywhere they wanted them, when they wanted them, and where they wanted them. But for this fact, that on April the 4th, 2019, this President Donald Trump said, frankly, there's only one person who is running DHS. You know who that is? It is me. So the responsibility for the insufficiency of staff and leadership and direction and mission and commitment at DHS lays right at his feet. I want to ask a couple of questions about the impact of some of these vacancies. I've had a lot of conversations with Mr. Bukowski. He's really presented himself as a very competent, caring, and comprehensive TSA administrator. What impact does it have on getting TSA where it needs to be and where we thought we were moving in the right direction by having him also simultaneously hold the position of Deputy Secretary? Exactly how does that impact this organization? That's number one. Number two, we have a list of 25 or so top positions that report to one person. And of those, there are 13 vacancies with one person doubling up, Mr. Bukowski. This is the leadership of these various components. We have no idea here today, Mr. Chairman, how many people who work in those components that have vacancies. So we don't really know how stripped this particular department is. And it's very concerning to me because other than building a wall and castigating the people coming in from the South, I don't know whatever else this doggone department is doing, and I need to know. So you need to tell me, how lean is this organization? How difficult it is for it to get any of its important things done other than trying to build a wall and protect the southern border. And so I would first, would love to hear from you, Mr. DiDardo, and then from you, Mr. Roth. And I did not know that you had retired, and I'm sorry that you retired. And I think the department is sorry that you retired, and it's a sorry situation that we have an acting Inspector General, but I think we're in a sorry and crisis situation. And so I'm going to give you the last 1.39 seconds of my time to answer those questions and recognize how absolutely frustrated I am.
I see that. I would say, with regard to the TSA issue, they've designated somebody to be in charge of the program, so I don't think there's an intent that they're going to be double-hatted. I think the effect on TSA is somewhat mitigated because the current administrator that's confirmed is staying within the department, so that mitigates it a little bit as opposed to leaving later, and we'll have to see how well they function. And
but that truly was a full-time job for him.
Oh, of course, of course. And the deputy will be a full-time job for him as well, but he'll still be in the department to provide, oversight and direction, and they have somebody designated. So we'll have to see how they perform. It's not the ideal situation. It's not the ideal situation in that area. Now, with regard to how deep the vacancies go, there are, according to information we got from the department, about 84 positions at the assistant deputy secretary level and above, and about 32% of those are vacant at this point in time. They don't have a confirmed person. Now, most of them have acting people in them, so it's not like there's nobody home. So that tells you, gives you a pretty good picture overall. And I'll yield my 8 seconds to John.
So we may have people in those positions, but they're temporary residents, and I doubt that they have the...
I mean, TSA is a great example of what happens if you have high-quality leadership over time. And TSA has benefited from two very, very good administrators back to back. And I think it's made an enormous difference in transportation safety. So leadership matters, permanent leadership matters, and high-quality leadership matters. So that's my takeaway from TSA. But with regard to, for example, the deputy secretary being vacant since Elaine Duke left over a year ago. That's extraordinarily troubling to me. That is the chief operating officer who's responsible for long-term planning, budgeting, coordination, interagency coordination. So not having somebody in that position, I think, is especially troubling.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back because I have no time left.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for appearing today. I wish my colleague, Ms. Barragan, was still here. I'm going to state some vacancies as well. The Secretary, Deputy Secretary, the Chief of Staff, Undersecretary for Management, Chief Financial Officer, Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, Director of ICE, Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis, Undersecretary for Science and Technology, Undersecretary for National Protection and Programs Direction, Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communication, Director, Office of Biometric Identity Management, Inspector General, Assistant Secretary for Health Affairs and Chief Medical Officer, Assistant Secretary for the Private Sector, Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, Assistant Secretary for State and Local Law Enforcement, and Assistant Secretary for Policy Implementation and Integration. But welcome to the 116th Congress, gentlemen, where everything seems to be designed to attack a president, because these were vacancies in 2013. And yet all but two of those positions I just named, which is the case now, are filled by a highly qualified American citizen that has been placed in that position. That's the nature of chain of command. Chain of command is an efficient flow of authority and rank, either military or law enforcement. The authority automatically shifts, including without executive or administrative command. In the field, this happens. If there's an absence in chain of command, it's immediately filled by that ranking American. I believe it's a failure of this Congress when we politicize these things rather than seeking actual answers. The president has been pointed out that the buck stops with him. He's a leader who leads from the front. All the members here support comprehensive reauthorization, gentlemen. Many of the things that we've discussed today, it occurs to me, do you support, both of you gentlemen, please respond to this question, comprehensive reauthorization of DHS with centralized command and control, with focused congressional oversight responsibility through more streamlined and limited committee jurisdiction?
I think in terms of, a comprehensive reauthorization of the department to codify the unity of effort, I think is what you said.
Yes, sir.
And to ensure that we've got effective people in place to carry out those responsibilities. I agree with that. I would yield to Congress to decide how it decides to best organize itself.
Well, that would be within the parameters of the Constitution, so I appreciate you yielding that. Mr. Roth?
I was consulted during the authorization writing, and we think it is codifying many of the best practices that DHS has, and the sort of imprimatur of Congress, making it legislatively mandated as opposed to a simple internal control by the department, I think is a positive step forward.
Thank you each. In the interest of time, in my remaining time, thank you for what I'm hearing is that you essentially support what I believe is a bipartisan interest of this committee. It's the kind of thing we should be focused on as opposed to posturing for 2020. I'm concerned about technology. All of DHS agencies need new technology, but it seems to me that research and development is scattered and unorganized. In my remaining minute, I'd like you each to take 30 seconds, please, and respond to that. How can we fix that? Research and development is quite disorganized within DHS.
Yes, I believe we've issued some reports on that, and I'll provide them to the committee along with our recommendations.
Thank you, sir, for that clarification. We could expect that within a timely basis?
You'll have it by this afternoon.
Wow, that's very timely.
Yes, I would agree that, part of the issue with regard to information technology and technology in general is a lack of a strategic plan and a lack of oversight to sort of drive that into a productive way. So again, some of the issues that we've been talking about, the inability of the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary to actually understand what's going on within the components is a critical part of moving forward.
Thank you for your clarification, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Chairman. I do just want to start by reiterating my support for what my friend and colleague Peter King said, that I am nervous, and I haven't received enough information today to quell that nervousness, that we're losing our focus on terrorism. That was the roots and origins of this department, and we should go back to that focus. And I appreciate, as I'm asking these questions, if you could integrate, if you have any comments on that into your answers. You both mentioned two things that I found alarming. The first is that this department, when you boil it down, is a holding company for 17 different organizations. And then you also mentioned, and we have also commented on it, the incredible overlapping jurisdiction. If you were designing committee jurisdiction, the last way in which you would ever design it is the way it exists right now as it pertains to this department in question. So my question for both of you is, what are your ideas for how we can simplify this? Both the department structure as well as committee jurisdiction.
Well, certainly with the department structure, having a more fulsome staff for the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary, the Undersecretary for Management, and the Undersecretary for Policy and Planning is extraordinarily important, because what I saw during my tenure as Inspector General is the senior leadership continually sort of back on their heels and surprised by activities within their own components that they were unaware of. So this idea of being able to have internal controls and derive those internal controls from the senior leadership is very, very important.
And do you recommend the merger of any organization?
I do not know.
Okay.
I agree with John on that, and I think it's important to recognize, too, that a lot of departments and agencies of the federal government are holding companies. We're talking about the Agriculture Department, the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, where you have IRS as a component within it. But there you have agencies that have been in place a longer period of time. They have a lot of more continuity in terms of the positions, and they're more mature organizations. And I think you could strengthen the central management functions. I think it's also important to recognize if these agencies weren't within DHS, they'd have to coordinate across departments and agencies. And we have many, many recommendations of where that's a problem across government as well, because departments aren't coordinating as much across the agencies that they need to deal with. More and more problems require cooperation among different components of the federal government. So I think it's better within the department than outside the department, but you need to strengthen the structure within the department. You know, otherwise you could create other problems that I think would be perhaps more daunting.
And if you could just paint me a picture during both of your respective tenures at the department, were there highs and lows for when terrorism was considered as the priority in terms of your daily life?
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
could you tell me what those?
Well, I
how that
think
looked?
right after 9/11, that was the focus.
Yep.
I mean, that was the focus, getting TSA up and running and organized and have operating procedures in place. And I think that was the main focus until 2005, 2006, when Hurricane Katrina and Rita hit.
Sure.
And FEMA wasn't prepared, and we had a lot of disasters. So the lesson from that is that all missions of the department are important, and they need to keep their eye on the ball, whether it's terrorism, emergency preparedness, cyber issues, and other issues. So I think it's important that all the missions get equal treatment and attention over time. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem.
Okay, and last question, travel ban, which is, I know something that I know it's not immediately in our purview today, but it's a very simple question. When the travel ban was announced, what was also announced concurrently was that a review process would be undertaken. Many elected officials at the time were calling it a travel pause, not a travel ban. To your knowledge, what was undertaken, what is still going on as pertains to this review of the deficiencies in our system that led to the travel ban?
Yeah, I don't have information to respond to that now. I'll provide something for the record.
Please.
Yeah.
I don't have any insight into that either.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The title of this hearing is Trouble at the Top, Our Vacancies at the Department of Homeland Security Undermining the Mission. And yes, the answer is yes. I don't think there's any real disagreement on that. Of course we agree. I'm new here, so I don't always understand how everything works, but I'm not so sure why we needed a hearing for this, because we agree. I don't think anybody wants there to be vacancies at the top. What concerns me is that we don't meet that often. We don't have full committee hearings that often. The last one was March 6th, I believe. And if we care about the mission and we care about if that mission is being undermined, then we should be talking about how to fix it and what this committee can do to fix it. We're not the administration. We can't nominate more political appointments. We're not the Senate. We don't advise or consent. But there is a lot we can do. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And I do share some of the concerns: counterterrorism, cyber. I'm from Texas, so the border is in crisis mode right now. 200,000 people. That's the approximate number of CBP apprehensions along the southwest border since the last time this committee held a hearing. Just since the last time we held a hearing, 200,000. In March, 103,492 were apprehended. According to CBP, April will be on par with that. Border Patrol estimates they actually only catch 1 in 3 people, so we can figure that that's actually about 600,000 illegal crossings in March and April. 96,237, that's the number of apprehensions along just the Texas border between March 6th, the last time this committee held a hearing, and April 24th. It's safe to say at least 3,763 more have crossed in this last week, so we can just call it an even 100,000. In the same period, 51,983 pounds of marijuana, 1,342 pounds of cocaine, 207 pounds of heroin, and 2,856 pounds of methamphetamines have been seized along the Texas-Mexico border. This is just Texas. 2 U.S. soldiers were disarmed by the Mexican military on the U.S. side of the border. Human smugglers are using drones now to reconnoiter routes. Heavily armed escorts are being used to illegally traffic people into the U.S. We have video of this. Border Patrol agents are being taken away from patrolling the border to staff processing centers. This leaves critical gaps unmanned. 750 CBP officers, who usually staff ports of entry, have been relocated to help deal with the humanitarian crisis staffing at processing centers. Compared to last year, we've seen an increase of more than 370% in the number of family units apprehended at the southern border. Children are arriving sicker than ever before. And because of our broken asylum system, children have become tokens for free passage. Human traffickers and drug cartels are benefiting from this broken system. These are the harsh realities of a crisis on the border that we should be addressing. But instead, we're spending the committee's time, we're looking at something we don't control. We aren't the administration, again. We don't nominate. We aren't the Senate. We don't provide advice or consent. I think we can all agree that the number and length of these vacancies is definitely a problem. We agree. Done. Acting leaders can't implement a long-term vision, and we don't have and they do not have the status of confirmed leaders. That limits their ability to actually lead and manage. However, instead of looking to do what we can, this committee is using this hearing as a tool to message and bash the administration. Last time we met for a hearing, it was with Secretary Nielsen. Did we really try to get facts and answers from her? Or did we bring her here for a circus? To get sound bites for fundraising emails? What we can do is help DHS accomplish its mission. We can help by working to fill the vacancies throughout the organization by addressing problems CBP has had with recruitment and retention. That's, for instance, why I proposed H.R. 1609, which would waive the polygraph requirement for CBP applicants with law enforcement or military experience who've already gone through thorough vetting. I ask that we spend our time finding solutions to fix this absolute mess in our border rather than messaging in preparation for 2020. In my limited time, I do want to ask you all, because this hearing has vacillated between two subjects. One is management, which has been productive, and the other is filling vacancies, which we have no control over, political appointment vacancies. On the matter of management, as a ranking member, and I work with Chairwoman Torres-Small, who's been great on this, we would like to do that. What are your top 3 priorities as far as fixing, or that we should focus on in that subcommittee, the Subcommittee of Management, Oversight, and Accountability?
I think the first priority I would mention is in the human capital side. You have critical skill vacancies. You have right now the Customs and Border Patrol are almost 7,000 people short of their goal. You have vacant skill gaps in the cyber area, and acquisition management area, financial management area. People are important, and they're essential to having good management operations. It's not just the leaders, it's the skills of the people that support the leaders as well. So that'd be my number 1 area. Number 2 area would be long-term planning for FEMA in particular. I think in the last, since 2005, the federal government spent nearly $500 billion on natural disasters. There's still no way to determine how prepared state and local entities are. Is the money going to help them prepare them properly? Do you have a disaster resilience framework in place? How are they implementing the new legislation of the Congress on the Disaster Response Recovery Act? I think that's critical to the department and limiting the federal government's fiscal exposure. And then the last area of the 3 that I would focus on would be in the area of cybersecurity. I think that area, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government's not moving with a sense of urgency commensurate with the emerging threat. And new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, other things, are going to make that problem a lot worse, not better, over time. And so those would be my top 3.
Thank you very much. For the gentleman from Texas information, the Secretary of Homeland Security was scheduled to be at this hearing today to talk about the Department of Homeland Security and its budget. She was fired. The second person was scheduled to take her place. She quit. And so we've gone on and on talking about vacancies. So we felt that since everybody who's running the shop is either fired or leaving, it's important to talk about vacancies. And the fact that we have over 50 senior leadership positions at the time of this hearing still vacant. Leadership's important. And so oversight, which is a primary mission, and it's come out today that we have to do oversight in order to get it right. So this is part of the oversight responsibility of the committee. Gentleman now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you having this hearing. That's what we're here for. And, I'm sorry the gentleman from Texas just left, but, these vacancies, some of them are frightening. Some of them are strategic, based on the president's understanding of what his job is. I don't think that it's a mistake that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection position is vacant. He wants to run that. It doesn't surprise me that U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is vacant. he wants to run that. Office of Inspector General, well, you don't have anybody checking to make sure things are going properly. And on and on and on. And, my colleagues on the other side continue to talk about the vacancies in the prior administration. But let us reiterate one more time that there was a concerted effort to keep the previous president from having people go through the process. That's not the case now. It went as high as the Supreme Court, the last president. So let's the apples and oranges here, okay? This is an effort by the president to control this department to the degree he wants to control it. The past president was not given the opportunity to fulfill his obligations to this department. Period. Let me ask my question now. Mr. Ross, as you know, the TSA administrator is also fulfilling the deputy secretary responsibilities. How will this impact airport security across the country?
As Mr. Dodaro pointed out, obviously they have an acting administrator for TSA, but it is a critically important job, and TSA is really still an agency that is a work in progress, and a lot of things need to occur, for example, with regard to hiring, with regard to acquisition of new equipment, IT issues that they have. All along the spectrum, TSA has to improve its operations. So anytime that you remove senior leadership, what you do is you remove the ability to engage in long-term planning, decision-making, and those kinds of things. And the other thing is, and I've known this from firsthand, every morning they have a threat assessment, they have a threat briefing that the administrator attends, and it's critically important to make sure that there's a politically accountable individual who is making the decisions with regard to the safety of passengers, air passengers.
Doesn't look like many people are there at that threat assessment, does it? The gentleman from Texas once again said that he hasn't been here that long, and so he doesn't know, and he's right. He hasn't been here that long, and he doesn't know. To have U.S. Customs and Border Protection, something that this administration has been just overwhelmed or enamored with, and then not to have a leader there, what does that do for the morale in that department? What does that do for having direction in that department? Everybody, the other side is so worried about, the border protection, but hey, you don't need a director. You don't need anyone at the top. It's absurd. It just doesn't make sense. When something serious happens, we're gonna all be looking at each other and trying to tell the American people why we do not do our job. And I yield back.
Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to pause for a minute, and I have great respect for Mr. Payne, but we need to be careful and keep the proper decorum in this committee and not disparage other members about what they do and don't know. It's okay to say you hadn't been here long, but to say another member of this committee doesn't know something, I think is a little bit too far. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, he said it. He was repeating what Higgins said.
And then he came back and said, and he doesn't know.
No,
And
but
Based on the gentleman's length of time here.
We just need to be
well, So the only thing I'm saying is, you know, I respect each member's how they got here and that, and I let Mr. Higgins just get his 5 minutes, and I'll give Mr. Payne the same respect to his 5 minutes. So that's all the time that we have. Let me just say to the witnesses, thank you very much for your expert testimony. What I'd also like to ask Mr. Dodaro, some of us are vitally interested, ranking member and myself, in trying to fix some of this. Whatever ideas you might have, if you would make those ideas available to us, we'd appreciate it. We want to get it right. Whether it's a natural disaster, an act of terrorism, or whatever, it impacts Americans, and we need to do that. So I do thank you for your participation, and I'd like to also, and your testimony, the members of the committee will have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing, as you've already committed to. Without objections, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.